morning. Welcome to our first annual Bus7 Retail Breakfast. I'd like to first welcome all our guests here this morning. We have started with this retail breakfast idea quite a while ago, and we have two special guests all the way from South Africa this morning, Ms. Lynne Krog and Mr. Graham Sinclair. They are representing Spark Media from Caxton Group South Africa. We are live on Facebook this morning. I'd like everyone just to go into our Republican, Namibian Sun and Algemeine Zeitung Facebook pages. Just share it to your timelines. Welcome to all the viewers that are watching, and welcome to all our corporate guests this morning. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first guest speaker, Mr. Daniel Kaveshe, Group Economist at First National Bank Namibia, with over 5 years' experience analyzing the Namibian market. Please put your hands together for Daniel.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to try that again. Good morning, everyone. After such a hearty and lovely breakfast, I expected a little bit more energy. Thanks for having me today. I think the idea is that I'm meant to butter you up and tell you all the great things that are going on in the Namibian economy before we start dealing with retail trends and behavior in the market. I'm not sure how well I'll be able to do that, considering for those who have been operating in Namibia over the past few years, we've had a little bit of a difficult time, specifically in retail. But I'm hoping this morning I can put most of what you're seeing and what we're seeing, even as a bank, into context. So as you've heard, my name is Daniel Kaveshe. I'm also joined today by Rusa Nandago. Rusa, please wave. Thank you. So she actually did all the work. The idea is I just tend to look much better in a tie, hence the reason why I'm the one giving the presentation. I thought I'd start off with something that I've used before, and I think it's very integral for us to think about when we discuss any economy globally. Now, way back when the Jews had this idea that the world worked in 7-year cycles. And I think we see first notice of that when a little guy by the name of Joseph has a dream, and well, actually someone else had a dream, and then he interpreted it and said, yeah, there'll be 7 fat years and there'll be 7 lean years. And since then, the world has been obsessed with cycles and the impact that has on businesses. And so I decided to dissect about 2 years ago, once the recession started in Namibia, just to dissect and look at our Namibian market and ask that very question: do we have cycles? Are there clear indications, pre-independence, post-independence, that we go through this wave of where we've got, abundance, and then we also have periods where we've got somewhat lack or less? And the first thing I found that a lot of what we had pre-independence and into probably 1995 had to do with the cycles that, were based on rain. And so if we had good years and we had a lot of rain, the economy did quite well. And then in the poor rains where we had drought, and drought tends to be quite prolonged, then we had poor growth. But this is the first time we were entering an environment where we had this perfect storm, where we were in a drought. We didn't have a lot of activity coming in from our neighbors, specifically Angola, that was supporting our retail segment, our housing segment. We had our government slowing down. We had slowdown in international commodity prices. And all of that hit us all in once. And so the question regarding how long this cycle will last was pretty much similar to other countries, where for Namibia it seems to last between 6 to 7 years, between 2 peaks. Now, people often then ask me, where are we in the cycle? We've just finished our 3rd year. We'll be going into our 4th year next year. And based on indications that we have right now, next year is likely looking to be a recession as well, simply because one of the greatest segments of our economy, which is mining, is not having the easiest time as well, and that's what has been supporting growth in this very long period of time. Now, if you look at all these cycles, then you start asking bigger questions. You know, if we're only in our fourth year, what do we have then to prepare for the other 3 years, and how should our economy look like after this 3 years if we're going to be able to then be a sustainable economy? Now, we had thought about themes that are problematic specifically in the Namibian context. It's quite similar to what we find in the rest of Africa. One of the things that we're finding is that a lot of sub-Saharan African countries have been ramping up debt for the past few years, and we see this in Mozambique. In fact, they were so good at ramping up debt that they managed to hide over $1 billion of it from authorities, and that was discovered about 2 years ago. We've got high debt in areas like Zambia. I know some of you operate there, and so you're quite aware of the issues that they're having. Recently, when they released their budget, they had a similar problem to that of Namibia, where contractors in the Zambian environment weren't being paid by government. So there were delays in payments, something that we experienced 2 years ago. And then, of course, we also have South Africa that has a similar problem. So we've got ramp up of debt, but we don't see the capital expenditure or the development expenditure trickling into the economy, the stuff that you and I need to run our businesses, to keep money and cash in people's hands so that they can continue spending. We've got a problem with our state-owned enterprises in the sense that a lot of them have been growing in size, and we haven't necessarily been able to account for these industries from a perspective that they're not giving as much as we'd hoped from a revenue perspective. And so those became some of the challenges we're hoping. And now, internationally, when people look at us, specifically Fitch, Moody, we've been seeing in the news reports quite recently that they downgraded our credit. They're very concerned about our high unemployment and inequality, and they're concerned about social deficits, not just economic deficits that we're faced with. But yet we're still expected to do business. We're still expected to make money in this environment. So these few factors will definitely have to change in the next few years before we can then be on a sustainable path of growth. And what I mean by this very early on is that Namibia has benefited for several years from project-based led growth. And what do I mean by this? Every single time we've had this massive project that has come in, or one or two projects, that's allowed our construction companies to do well, our engineering fraternity to do well, and the money has sort of trickled in through the multiplier effects of every economy, and we're happy, we think everything is fine, but we haven't dealt with the inherent issues in our country, and for the first time we're starting to face them head on. And to look at what that looks like, this graph here, it's not abundantly clear, but if you just look at wages over the past few years, on average, companies were very comfortable giving about 7 to 8% increase in their wages a few years ago. Right now, I mean, you're lucky if you actually get an increase in salary. You're lucky if, you know, there's certain things which are still called bonuses. I know some people may have forgotten that term. They still exist, and there's some companies that still give them out. But these are things that have become completely non-existent to a lot of firms. And what that has meant is that from an unemployment perspective, we're having a lot of people who are not working. Yesterday's headlines, I think they broke all our hearts. I don't know if any of you saw the list and on the newspaper and the clips on Facebook. Just wave your hand if you know what I'm talking about. There were about 3,000 people who were queuing up for about 15 posts for cleaning at a ministerial level in Katutura. So these were cleaning posts, and they had 3,000 applications. And we saw something similar to this earlier this year up north when Transnamen was also hiring at the low level, and they had a bountiful, I think they had up to close to 4,000 people queuing up and applying. So the state of the country from that sense is not doing particularly great. And this is very problematic for all of us. We are known as an apathetic country, meaning generally Namibians have taken a very French approach to life. As the French say, laissez-faire, you know, let it be, we're fine. It's not necessarily such a problem. When we have a strike, it lasts like 2 days, and then we resolve things. We generally are not a type of people who are militant in any approach. We're not a type of people who are aggressive. We receive things. We accept things as they've come. And the problem that we're facing now is that our unemployment numbers are quite high, and for how long can we have youth unemployment being this high for the next couple of years? So these are deep questions we need to ask ourselves. And if you look at other countries where unemployment has been high, what has that meant for their societies?
And it has often meant that a radical change needs to take place in a very short period of time. Now, closer to home, how are you and I doing? Well, a few years ago, again, we were happy. We were borrowing money from the likes of us. We were buying cars, we were buying houses. We were buying furniture on credit. We were buying wedding rings on credit. We loved credit. Credit was our friend. And over the years, that piled up. In fact, if you look at the microlending sector, when I started working, it was an industry that was about 1 to 2 billion. In about 2-3 years, it was growing at about 25 to 30%. Now, microlending is a $7 billion industry. Now, microlending means that at least until about a year ago, people were allowed to charge any interest rate that they wanted, provided, I give you money now, and in a month's time, you come back and I pay you off. And that really should have been the first signs that we're in trouble, if we started seeing so many people using these microlending facilities. Now, when you combine all of that, you find that your debt to disposable income for an average Namibian is at about 94%. So that combines banking debt and microlending debt. In South Africa, it's in the 70s. If I'm not mistaken, it could be 71, 72. I know their methodology doesn't combine microlending. But again, for a very small country that is highly indebted, these are some of the problems you're facing with your customers. A lot of them, what they've been trying to do is pay off debt. I mean, even if Bank of Namibia starts cutting interest rates, you're not necessarily going to see a substantial change in your behavior at your retail outlets. A lot of people are just trying to pay off the debt which they took with a lot of energy. Now, that is not particularly clear, but what I can tell you is that there are two forms of debt. There's housing debt and vehicle debt, which is what we call secured lending. People like this because there's an asset of sorts behind it, and then there's the unsecured lending, which is your microlending, is your credit card, it's your overdraft, it's your personal loan on your personal loan on your personal loan, and we become very innovative in terms of naming some of these loans. And what we've found is that this has been growing by over 11%. Rus and I did an exercise, and we found that between 2016 and now, microlending debt has grown by about 8 to 9 billion. So that is unsecured lending of sorts, and it's $1 billion more than secured lending. So we're borrowing $1 billion more in our credit facilities than in all other facilities that we find in the bank. Again, that sort of confirms where we are. And then what that has meant is, from an inflation perspective, is that inflation really isn't moving because people aren't spending the way they used to, and so it becomes very difficult to ignite or resuscitate your economy. So we struggle in this environment because what we find is normally when you enter a recession for a place like Namibia, because of the costs that we import and everything like that, you will normally have a very high inflation, which makes life even more difficult for businesses. Now we're in an environment where it's low growth and non-existent inflation. So it's basically people just not spending in the economy the way they used to. And if you translate that to what people are spending their money on, well, alcohol is doing great, as one can imagine. They're actually doing absolutely fantastic. It's one of the resilient share price as well on our stock exchange. And that's been an area which has remained relatively consistent in terms of spending. And of course, basic things like food have also sort of been okay. Furniture, not so much. Clothing, almost non-existent. We have often found that you cannot increase prices in a lot of these retail stores, so inflation in those segments have either remained flat or it's gone negative, because a lot of stores now have to keep on cutting prices so you can get pretty much the same level of volumes, right? The other things that we find, like other miscellaneous goods and services, they also used to grow comfortably by over between 7 and 10%. Those numbers have also come down. So we're seeing all of this taking place in the economy, and the big question that all of us are having is, what do we do about it? How does it actually change? And the wholesale and retail trade sector has been telling us for the past few years that something needs to change very quickly because they employ a lot of people, even though average wages in that industry is quite low. But for the past few years, that sector has not been doing particularly well. Now, if I look at this here, I'm not sure if you can see it, but the numbers are actually quite negative. So since 2016, wholesale and retail trade has been almost non-existent. And what government has responded with is, of course, keeping tax relatively mute and they haven't necessarily made any changes on tax, as we've seen over the past few years, but there's talk about increasing tax in an environment such as this. Now, if you take all of that into consideration, I guess the question a lot of people have for me is, so what do people do when they get to this environment? Now, this is not necessarily bank view and I would call it a non-qualified opinion that I personally have about industries like this. And the first part is often at times is that people often have to wait. With a lot of cycles, you know that there is something at the end of it. The idea is how fit is your business before you can convert that into something else. A lot of people tell me innovation is probably one of the ways in which we can tackle, and this is what international companies have done. Your retail segment in Namibia alone is quite small. However, you're exposed to about 400 million customers if you look at SADC in its totality. And so a lot of businesses are asking that question, is there a way in which I can expand into other jurisdictions? And I've been receiving a lot of phone calls from companies, some of which are actually here, with having questions. How does Botswana look like right now? How does this jurisdiction look like right now? And I think these are the type of resilient companies that are saying, look, they understand cycles, but then they also know right now in certain jurisdictions, you're just not going to get the same level of revenue that you would have anticipated. A lot of people, target your marketing and advertising so that at the end of the cycle, things change. I just stole that from Lynne and Graham earlier now, and I'm just going to use that as it's my own idea. But I think they're right. A lot of times you really need to create such a brilliant and beautiful brand that it's on everyone's speech, so that at the end of the cycle, they have something to note you by. They have a reason to be able to associate their spending towards you. And then, of course, get into the alcohol business, because quite clearly that's doing quite okay, but that's just a joke. There are other industries where companies can diversify in, which is really what I'm trying to say. If you've had a traditional product, it just won't cut it nowadays. I think we've seen with a lot of our retail firms, it's become very difficult to have a specific set of products that you've become very attached to, and that's all that you would want to sell in an environment like this. No, right now you have to be absolutely creative and also understand some of the pains that are going through the minds of a lot of our consumers and households in the country. And in a few years' time, hopefully, when things start to change, you can then be at the forefront of a lot of these discussions regarding how retail should look like in Namibia moving forward. So thank you very much. I'm glad that you listened. I gave a very cheery overview of the Namibian economy, but I hoped it helped to put a lot of things in context and in preparation for what Lynne and Graham had to tell us about what's going on in terms of tastes and preferences. So thank you again.
Do we have any questions for Daniel? If there's anyone? Shall I write? Jo Marie.
Good morning, everybody. I do Market Watch and Bus7 for Namibia Media Holdings. Daniel, thank you very much for your insights. Very interesting as always. You mentioned in your speech that economic growth often tends to be project-led, and that we haven't looked at the inherent problems. Could you expand a bit on those inherent problems and how we should address those?
Yeah. So I think the big sort of snarling, the one that stares at us each and every day, from a policy perspective, is unemployment in our country, and of course the state of inequality, right? So I, recently, and at least over the past few years, I've always stated that we are what it is we measure. And for the longest time, what we measure in a lot of our countries, including Namibia, is GDP. It's growth, it's output, right? So we create more things, we have more output, that must definitely mean that we're doing okay. A problem of that is that it doesn't tell us about bread and butter issues that are taking place on a household level. It doesn't tell us, and it doesn't capture a lot of work that's being done by people, for example, like mothers. We cannot account for mothers and the type of work that they do at home when they take care of their children. We just figured it's great work and it probably wouldn't have that big of an impact on society. Problem that we're finding is that it does, and that's why a lot of people have started tracking other things. They track your human development index, So we don't frequently have data on education or health in Namibia as an example. So a lot of times we know the system is bad, we have issues with the system, but we don't know whether it's an issue of child enrollment. We don't know whether it's an issue of having teachers that are unqualified. We don't track this frequently, so it's not necessarily top of mind. Same thing that goes to health. We don't track our medicinal sector as aggressively as we should. And so it becomes very hard for us to have a policy discussion as a country to talk about the things that we care about when a lot of what we're tracking is basically output. And again, I don't necessarily have a problem with it, GDP as an indicator. All I'm saying is that we need to slice and dice it and look at other things that have become more important also and are more viable for the Namibian economy. The other thing, of course, that we could track with a little bit more effort is our agricultural sector. We're having these big debates, and what we've come and realized is part of this recession is that certain towns in Namibia really relied on the output and farming activities of farms in that area, 10, 15 farms that employed sufficient number of people that gave them lodging, and then they went and spent in the local retail stores, and those retail stores became profitable, and that impacted another sector. And so we don't track as aggressively as we should what's going on in the agricultural sector, and we don't offer sufficient support as such to that segment as well. And only quite recently, everyone has been talking about tourism. And we've got tourists in the country, and it's great, and our companies are doing great, and we've got hotels and restaurants, and we've got Airbnb now, but we haven't had that discussion as to, is the idea that we just track people who are entering the country and track bed occupancy, or are we tracking service levels, which could be a bigger problem for Namibia. So, I mean, it's a bit of a difficult question to try and answer, and I hope that has sort of unpacked it. But what I'm arguing for is, especially where we are as a state in our economy, where we're transforming, we need to start with the basic things, where we can get full employment. Let's just start with that. Commit to getting unemployment rate down to 4%. Other countries have done it. Why can't we, given especially our size? And as we put one target as this big indicator, then you start realizing that you're impacting education, because now companies might complain there's a mismatch of skill, etc. Then we realize, okay, so maybe we need to do something when it comes to skills level, and it becomes something almost like a snowball effect. Suddenly, in 5 to 10 years, you've had bigger areas of impact that constantly just saying we need growth to be at this level, then we have fixed everything. People often joke, we don't eat growth, so to speak. Yeah, I hope that helps. Yeah. Any other question? Yeah.
Good morning, Mr. Kavishe.
Morning.
You mentioned, why can't we reduce our unemployment rate to 4%? It's a very noble goal, but how is it possible to accomplish it under the current economic dire straits, in practical terms?
Well, there are a lot of value chains, even when the economy is not doing quite well, that we haven't tapped into. And I like using the tourism and hospitality because I think it's taught me a lot over the past few years. We've got sectors that grow by 18 to 15 billion, such as mining, and on and off, maybe they've got 1,000 to 1,500 employees who are permanent. A lot of the others are contractual. In the hospitality sector, over the past 10 years, the amount of people employed directly or indirectly has shot up to over 70,000 Namibian people. That's pretty much getting close to how much we employ people in sectors such as agriculture from a direct basis. So it's a little bit more in that segment. But it tells us that there's room for expansion and innovation in non-traditional markets where we haven't generally operated. Other sectors that we haven't potentially looked into is looking at the full value chain that's supplied in the wholesale and retail trade. What a lot of people don't realize, it's not just a few stores that are selling. There's transportation involved. There's a full value supply chain management system that we can profit from as a country. So a lot of the times it's dissecting what we already have and then unpacking it a little bit more. Given the dire economic strains, I do hear you, but I think a lot of the things that we need to decide first is by choice. Do we want to have 4% unemployment, which is basically just frictional people moving in between jobs? We've never stated in any policy document that we want. We've always said we want to lower unemployment. And when you say you want to lower unemployment, you're allowing people to feel comfortable when they hire an extra person at the office. You're not creating a mindset where creativity is fully flowing into that singular policy discussion. And that's what other countries have done. I think a big impact of that as well is through technology, right? We have fairly safe environment. Our internet systems and telecommunications sector is not necessarily the worst in the world. It's actually one of the good ones. There's more value we can have for online businesses, online retail. We're doing sufficient a lot of work in the finance sector to allow Namibians to start having businesses online which they can operate from, which target international companies. And that's pure innovation, entrepreneurship drive that's there. So I know it seems like it's such a fairy tale, but I promise you, if you decide that this is a policy decision that you, in singularity, want to tackle, you will be surprised at the results that you'd get. And it seems crazy, but I mean, even our neighbors in Zambia, they've got their unemployment rate down to about 20%, which is even better than the South African case, right? And again, with them, it's decision, it's finding industries where the young people can participate and then allowing innovation to flourish and grow. I think part of the big restrictions in Namibia as well is policy, and we've spoken several times or in several platforms as to how inhibiting policy is in this country, but that's something that shouldn't last. So it shouldn't take 3 months to open up a country, when in Australia about 20 years ago already it took 20 minutes. Yeah. It's very funny. It's very, very funny. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I would just like to thank our InTouch integrated system for our RSVP system that you all RSVP'd on. You should all have received an SMS. Just after the breakfast, I'd like you to all fill in the survey that's on that link. It's just 5 questions about the event and how you've experienced what was discussed here today. I'd just like to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Lynne Krog. Originally from Zimbabwe, studied business science at UCT, specializing in market and research. She then moved to the United Kingdom, where she had a 22 career in market research with Research International based in their specialist advertising and media division for the next 10 years, working across a multitude of clients based both in the United Kingdom and across Europe. In 1997, she arrived in South Africa, raised 4 children, and built and managed a restaurant in Natal, Midlands for the next 4 years. 12 years ago, she returned to the safety of market research and managed and ran Roots Industry-wide, a community-based research undertaken by Caxton every 3 years. Her current areas of research expertise include advertising evaluation, brand health, print media, and usage and attitude research. Thank you so much. Put your hands together for Lynne.
Good morning, everybody. I can tell you the hardest part of that whole journey was the restaurant bit. So hard. And the 4 children as well. I seem to have lost my presentation. Anyway, so today what I'm going to be doing is taking you through Roots research, which is South African-based research, but it doesn't matter because some of the implications that we're seeing within that research transcend across all economies. Like we were talking about, I started my career in the UK, and I used to do a lot of research across Europe because UK was quite a good base and cheap base for people to use to find out about England versus Spain versus the whole lot. And when I started working on the Roots research many years later, I discovered this is a bit like doing European research because Roots is all about specific individual communities within South Africa. And you've got to be very nervous of averages because when you look at South Africa and you look across all their communities, you find one is very different to another. It's a bit like looking at different countries and seeing some countries are doing okay and other countries are not doing okay. But at the end of the day, it's the trends that you see across all of those places that have implications for all buyer behavior across the world. So that's what we're going to be looking at today with the roots research. There's just some implications. Let me see if that's working. Yeah, so first I'm going to introduce roots and tell you what it's, a little bit what it's about. Okay. A little bit what it's about. Oh, so it was working fine previously. Then what we're going to do is have a look at some of the macro implications based on the roots data and what that means for you as businesses, specifically within the retail space. And then we're going to go on to just a few what this means for you in terms of making marketing decisions going forward. So how can we help? What can we do in order to make better marketing decisions? And this will be based on roots, but it'll also be based on the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, which is a group of marketing scientists based in Australia. And you probably think marketing scientists, what has marketing got to do with science? But actually, what they've found is employing and using economics and data trends, they've actually found that there are some underlying buyer behavior, empirically based evidence that buyers behave in certain ways. Now that is amazing for marketers because what it means, because it's empirically based, it means that you can trust it. It's always going to happen that way. So what they've done is come up with a whole lot of rules of marketing behavior that you can actually use to guide your marketing decisions going forward. And what's quite interesting is that these are not difficult. They're actually a little bit like common sense, which makes our life a lot easier. But it's nice to know that there are some rules that you can follow that are going to help you grow your business. So before we go on to explaining roots, we're going to have a bit of a video, and hopefully the music will play. No, it won't. Well, you can look at the pretty video. I'm not going to sing, or I'm not going to do anything with it, but you can sort of see what it's all about. Now the next slide. Sorry. Can you just move it forward on the laptop because it's not working? Cool. So you've seen the nice video, but what is Roots? Okay, so Roots, every 3 years, Caxton as a group invests close to 16 million rand undertaking this research. The important thing about it, it's pure random sampling. Purchase decision makers within the household, so you're talking to the money within the households. And the sampling is done at the community level, so not across the whole of South Africa, one random sample. It is 100 random samples covering the likes of Hilton in the Midlands, which is quite a wealthy small community, to Mitchell's Plain in the Cape. So very different communities across the whole of South Africa. And you can see a little bit of it there. And it covers pretty much 100% of all the upper income homes across the country. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, and trends across this. So it's done every 3 years, and going back to 2004, when the research company that undertakes the work, which is Kantar, which is an international research agency, we've been doing it in a pretty similar fashion since then. So we've got trends going back all the way to 2004. Now, so what's this got to do with Namibia? Well, as I've mentioned earlier in my introduction, is that you can have a look and see some macro trends that are happening that you can apply across any country because they apply to buyer behavior. Okay. And that's what we're going to do. And as we said, Roots is supported by the Ehrenberg Bass and the economics and econometrics patterns that we're seeing happening. Okay. So let's have a look at some of the retail battlefield that's out there and some of the things that are happening. So you can see, what do we know for sure from a macro level? And I think that picture sums it up pretty carefully. It's a battlefield out there. And it's true across a lot of, in South Africa, it's starting to hot up really badly. I think if, as Danny said, you have 7-year cycles, and if you're in year 4, I think South Africa is probably in year 2, so we've got a lot longer ahead of us than you guys do. Yeah. So the bad news is in times when things get bad, in recessionary times, what we see is that there's less people buying, and those people who are buying less often. Okay, so everything's going to go down. People are more value conscious, so they're looking for deals more. People are more fickle, so they're going to be shopping across a lot of different retailers rather than just sticking to one. And then people are time-strapped and convenience-driven. So it just all makes for a much more difficult environment for you to do business in. But the good news is that even when times are bad, life still happens. So things go on as normal because your fridge still breaks, or life, you still get married, you still have babies. So things are still happening, they're just not happening at the rate that they were happening previously. And so the idea is that you have to understand how you can tap into the life that is still happening and get the sales that are still happening in order to grow or just stand still. So let's first have a look at this bit of information here. People buy less often, and less people buy. So what we see, and this actually, I promise you, Danny and I didn't speak before this presentation. What we're seeing here is from the Roots data. In South Africa in 2008, 2009, that's when we sort of went into the last recessionary period that we had. And you can see here, this is just for audio-visual equipment. It's the percentage of people who looked for or bought within that category in that year. And you can see the downward trend from 2008 all the way down to 2013. And things were better in 2013, but the buying only started to pick up again in 2016. So it actually fitted in very, very nicely with that 7-year cycle that we're talking about. Now we sit in going into 2020, and we're starting one of those cycles again. So you can start to say, okay, now people are going to be buying less often. This is audio-visual. We see the same with large electrical appliances, and we see the same with small electrical appliances. So what happens is that this pattern is more exaggerated with non-regular purchases. So things that you don't have to buy every day, like food, for example. So what will happen is that these are the industries that are going to be hit the hardest and have to think about ways to actually sustain themselves going forward. The more regular purchases, like your coffee or you'll still carry on with that. Sorry, thank you. You're still going to carry on with that behavior, but you might not actually drink coffee as regularly. So instead of 3 cups a day, it might go down to 1 cup a day. Or maybe you'll start making it at home instead of going and getting takeout coffee. Interestingly, you also get something called the lipstick factor, which when times are bad and you can't afford a big holiday, what you're going to do is then treat yourself with smaller things, like maybe 3 coffees a day. So sometimes you actually see things like that picking up in bad times, but the bigger purchases, the more non-regular, expensive purchases tend to go down. Okay. And okay, so here we just have some econometrics data that just backs up what we've seen, but in other industries, and this is what's starting to happen now in the South African economy, your clothes buying is going down, another sector that Danny was talking about. Your food and beverage has gone down slightly, and your durables has gone down. So you can start to see the trend beginning. In our Roots data, what we see is that from 2016 to now, people are buying less regularly than they were before. So what this is telling you in the red bars is there's significantly less people buying in 2 to 3 months, and there's significantly more people buying, and this is clothes, buying in the last 4 to 5 months or 6 to 12 months. So the regularity of the shopping has gone down. What I wanted to show you this one for, and it looks very frightening and all these big lines and everything, but what this is showing you is that in your non-regular buying, so your durables market, the markets are very thin. There are not very many people in the market at any given time. And you can see this is the trend across South Africa. So if you look at that blue line, every single dot on that blue line represents a community that was researched. And that could as easily be a country in the world. So what you're seeing at the far end is that in some areas there's very little buying going on in the audiovisual world. You can see sitting at about, it's the number actually, so it's not a big market. Whereas you get up to the top here and you get some that are actually very buoyant. There's a lot of, it's the size of the place, but it's also, there's a lot of people looking and buying. If you look back down there now, that's 12 months. Now if you have a look at the teal line, that is in the last month. And then you look at the pink line, and that's in a week. So you can start to see on a weekly basis, they're very thin markets. There's very few people in the market at any given time, which makes the battlefield even more difficult because you're competing on a weekly basis for very few people who are in the market. And you could easily equate this to countries as well. So we're going to take one, the Midrand. You can see where it's sitting there. So quite a buoyant, there's a lot of buying going on, a very young, professional, black community within South Africa. If you're talking about debt, there's a lot of debt going on there. So a lot of, they're either renting or so your fixed assets, the car installments, the bonds and the rent that's being paid on the house is huge. And then you get after that school fees, and then you get medical aid. The list is very long, and they've got a lot of things coming out of their account every month. And you've got 2 professionals working in the household. The average monthly household income has gone up from 2016, but in net terms, they're actually worse off now than they were previously because it hasn't gone up in terms of the inflation, so it hasn't gone up enough. And you're finding that in a lot of the communities across South Africa. Okay. So this is Midrand, and you can see it's a very thin market when it gets to the top. So weekly, you don't have many people who are in the market for, I think this is audiovisual. And look at all the choices people have in terms of where to go. So there's less people and there's more choice in terms of where you're going to go to buy. So you have to fight even harder to get the people who are in the market on a weekly basis. So people are more value conscious, we found. So previously, 2013, you found 7 out of 10 people planned their shop. Now it goes to 8 out of 10, and now it's 9 out of 10. So what happens is that when you have less money, you're buying less often, you're going to plan. You're going to search out where you can get what you want to buy at a decent price. And that's a very important thing to know. You need to be telling people, if you're selling something, you need to be telling them where to go, okay, and what price they can expect to pay. Okay. And it's not just in the lower LSMs or the lower economic groups that we're finding this. It's across the entire sample. So the lower, the middle, and the upper. And in fact, if you look at those numbers, you can see the upper LSMs are actually planning more than the lower. This one, people are more fickle. So, yeah, there's this whole idea that you've got loyal customers and they are loyal to you and they're always going to come and shop at you. But actually, people are, and this is evidence-based. This has got evidence behind it. This is people, you share your customers with other retailers. Always, you're sharing. So people are not loyal to you. You're literally just sharing your customers as also somebody else's customers, and you're sharing them. So what can you do in this situation? You must never rely on loyalty and thinking, I've got this loyal base of people that are always going to come to me. It doesn't work in that way. You share customers. This is just a bit of food and grocery data from the UK, and you can see Pick n Pay remains the #1 retailer for food and groceries, but Checkers has gained a lot of ground from 2013 to now. ShopRite's lost a bit of ground, but this is how the landscape lies. So, but Checkers doesn't just have loyal Checkers customers. Checkers customers, Pick n Pay customers also shop at Checkers, and they also shop at ShopRite, and they also shop at Woolworths. And they shop at those retail outlets in proportion to what the market shares are out there. And this is something which we find across any sector, anything that you're buying. You share your customers in proportion to what the market shares are in the industry. That's how you share your customers. So big people remain big and always get a bigger portion, and small people get a smaller portion. And it's actually quite difficult to change that pattern. It takes a lot of spend and a lot of a lot of hard work. Loyalty. What we've also seen, and it probably applies here because it talks to buyer behavior, is that there are more people with loyalty cards out there. You can see significant increase, 52% to 72%. And more people have got more loyalty cards as well. So you think, oh, this is good news. This means that people are loyal to me. Actually, no. It just means that you've got a lot of clever shoppers out there because they use the loyalty cards to get discounts. And what happens is that people who have loyalty cards tend to be your heavy buyers or the people who are going to be coming to you anyway. So what does that mean for you? It means that you're giving discounts to your people who are going to shop from you anyway. So your bottom line is going to be affected by that. People are clever. Consumers know what they're doing. And that's, if we look at some evidence for that, you can see the Pick and Pay Smart Shopper card. So does that mean that Pick and Pay Smart Shopper card holders are more likely to go to Pick and Pay and nowhere else? Well, no, actually, the pattern is exactly the same as we saw previously. Now, the market's about to be disrupted a little bit in South Africa because you're getting a Checkers loyalty card coming out. And yes, it might disrupt things for a little bit, but then soon it's just going to be another loyalty card that sits in the purse and it undermines the heavy shoppers who are going to Checkers anyway. And then finally on this path, we're going to have a look at people are time-strapped and convenience-driven. And I know here in Namibia, you are actually traveling much further distances than we do in South Africa. But it still comes down to the fact that as soon as things start to become easier and more convenient for people, they do it more often. And what happens is that in South Africa, you're getting ever-shrinking catchment areas. So once upon a time, 2000, even before then, Joburg CBD was the big shopping hub. So everybody would travel or they would go to Sandton. Now, it just doesn't happen anymore because there's so many convenient shopping centers for people to go to. So the catchments are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, which is another, if you're a retailer or you're selling something within that retail space, your catchment is shrinking, so your market is shrinking as well because people are not going to travel from outside or too far to come and get what it is that you're offering unless there's an incredibly compelling reason for it. So, I mean, this just shows you within the VAL, each area within the VAL that was researched has a different shopping center or different 2 shopping centers that they use. Whereas once upon a time, it might have just all been VAL Mall because that was the main center. Also, people are not prepared to travel very far. These figures, people are going to travel 10 minutes for anything. In some areas, it's 9 minutes. In others, it goes up to 16 minutes. The furthest people are prepared to travel is for a car, which is a big decision. But still, your catchment, if you're a retailer, is limited. There's no point in advertising too far out of it. Okay, so tough times have real implications. And winning means more customers, slightly more often. And when there's less customers buying less often, that becomes even more difficult to do. So how can we do this? Let's have a look at a guide to maybe help you make this decision. So you've got to turn these tangible insights that we've seen into actual measures that you can implement. So the first thing we look at is obviously brands grow by selling more or to more people. Okay? And what is a customer? A customer is anybody who buys within the category that you're selling. Anybody. You've got to be incredibly careful not to segment your market. I'm sure you've all heard of segmentation, and you've seen that I've worked in market research for a very long time, and there are millions and millions of dollars that are spent by brands specifically segmenting their market, deciding which group is it that I want to go after. Is it young females? Is it, and they will spend millions on a UNA study that will give them 10 groups of people that buy into the category that they're selling. And of those 10 groups, this group here, they buy the most. It's a high index. They buy most of the brand. So that's who we're going to actually target all of our communications towards, because that's going to make a lot of sense. That's going to help us grow our market. Actually, what's happening is that you're taking a very small number of people within your potential market and you're concentrating all of your communications towards them, and so you're missing out on a whole bunch of other people that are out there in the market. And it's very dangerous. It's like writing a suicide note, because your shoppers are fickle, we know that, and they shop across a whole lot of different retailers, and so it doesn't work if you just talk to one group. And this is very, very simple diagram, but what it shows you is that in order to grow, you have to focus your attention not on your heavy buyers. You have to focus your attention on your more occasional, less regular buyers or non-buyers within the category. You could apply this to a country. So imagine Namibia is that little purple bit in the middle. And what Danny's just been talking about is saying, you know, how are we going to grow? Well, you're going to grow by looking at more less occasional buyers that maybe sit outside of our borders. You can go across to Zambia or Botswana, or you can go have an internet business that goes outside the borders completely. So that's how you're tapping into a bigger market. They're not your heavy buyers. And ironically, is that if you focus your communications on these lighter buyers, the heavy buyers take care of themselves. They're in the market anyway. You don't have to concentrate too much effort on talking to those heavy buyers. You look at growth by going to your light buyers and your less occasional buyers that are within the category. And that's what you should be focusing on. That's where the growth opportunity lies. Very simple, very simply, what marketing comes down to, and getting more customers comes down to, is building mental availability. I like to call it power in the mind, and that's being thought of when somebody's in a buying situation. You've got to get your brand into people's minds, and that's what advertising agencies do very well. But you've also got to build physical availability, and from a retail aspect, that's going to be your bricks and mortar. But it's also, physical availability is also your pricing. So if you outprice yourself, you're going to lose a big section of the market. But obviously you don't want to price yourself too low that you can't sustain your business. But pricing is part of that as well. How do you do that? You do that with recognizable, distinctive assets. So your brand, your logo, you devise something that's distinctive and you make it an asset of your brand, and then you stick to that like gold, because you're going to be spending millions and millions in getting that branding out there, and you want people to remember it. So the last thing you want to do is every few years come up with a new look and a new feel. What you do is you spend a bit of money coming up with a distinctive asset right at the very beginning, and then you stick to it. So F&B has the color and the logo, and if they change their logo, it'll probably change very slightly, but not so that it's unrecognizable. It's very important. You can refresh things, but you've got to keep it distinctive and to the integrity of that distinctive asset that you develop right at the beginning. Okay. And now just some steps. Okay, so this is from Ehrenberg Bass. Thank you very much. So when you're looking at your market, you think inclusion rather than exclusion. That's all about segmentation. As soon as you segment, you're excluding a whole bunch of people who are your potential customers. So include everybody who's within your market. Make your target market decisions evidence-based. Avoid the heavy buyer trap, that pink bubble in the middle, which I spoke about. Buy media on numbers and not indices. This goes to segmentation as well. So you get an index, one group who's buying your product a lot, and you concentrate everything on them. There's the trap you don't want to fall into. And most importantly, you don't sacrifice reach for engagement. So advertising is always about reach, reaching as many people as you possibly can within your market, as many of your customers as often as you can. Okay. So just a few general. Who's your target market? Anybody in your category. Your media objective, reach as many of these people as you can, as continuously as you can. And then the message, well, always remind people of the reasons why they need to buy, and just continue with that message. You don't have to change it up all the time, because people are very we've got so much in our brain at the moment, we forget our names some days. So you just have to remind them of the basics of why they need to buy into the category or buy into you. If something very new and different comes up, then great, you can actually remind people about it if it's something new and different and it's worth talking about. Otherwise, you just stick to the path. Okay. And what role does media play within this objective? Well, as we've said, you need to reach as many people as possible, and this comes down to mass effective reach. So mass being more, as many as you can within the category, and as continually as you possibly can. What you don't want to do is spend your money reaching the same person 10 times. You want to reach 10 people once, and that's what makes it effective, because you're reaching more people. Okay. Well, and then effective at the right time. So I've shown you thin markets. There's very few people in the market in any given week for a fridge, for example, but every single week there is somebody in the market for a fridge. So you always have to be there nudging people at the right time as they're about to make a buying decision. Okay. So as a strategy, you need to nudge people when they're ready to buy. I've seen that. Catch them when they fall. And how do you do this? Continuous exposure. If you're a retailer specifically, you need to show your range. So don't go out there with one or two products, because then you're going to get the people who are in the market for those one or two products. You need to show range all of the time, so that you're going to pick up as many potential buyers as possible across the full range. And then you need to time it so that you're part of the planning process. And we know from South Africa, and I'm sure it's the same here, is that most people do their shopping over the weekend because they're not working over the weekend. So that's how it happens. So you reach them just before the weekend when they're actually making their buying decisions. Effective via a medium that fits the task. And what we've found is 9 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 people, and this is across the entire sample, are using the advertising inserts or the advertising within our newspapers to actually plan for their shopping. So this means that it's actually part of the planning stage. It's almost like it's being on the shelf. So if you're selling something, if you're not on the shelf, you're not going to sell. And the papers and the price and the product that people are being shown are actually part of that planning process. And if you're not there and not within that environment, it's a bit tantamount to actually not being on the shelf when people are making the buying decision. And we know that it's the same situation here, just from your readership figures that we get. And also the fact that the reason that this happens is that over many, 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 many years, people have developed the habit of knowing that this information is available to them in that environment. And now they know when they're actually about to make a decision on what it is that they want to buy, they know that they can go there and find the place and the price that they want to buy it at through the papers and through what advertising is available to them there. So finally, just in conclusion, effectiveness is very important, and then efficiency comes after that. But the key driver to brand growth is actually effective media choice, effective advertising, and then you go down to efficiency, which is the price. Obviously, you've got to get the most for your price. So mass effective reach, more relevant customers, more often, at the right time, in the right context. Okay. And yeah, newspaper networks tend to provide that. And this is, obviously, the research from a Caxton perspective is done because we need to show evidence that the papers are still working, because everybody is telling us that newsprint is dead. But actually, what you're finding is that for what it is that we're doing, newsprint is absolutely not dead. It's still got a very, very important place to play in disseminating news at a local level that's relevant to you, but also to help people make relevant local shopping decisions, because the geography is so important. Okay, thank you. Questions, if there are any.
I'm Helene from Nedbank.
Hi.
I want to find out, are these results also applicable to the service industry like banks?
Absolutely. They're
100%.
applicable to every single product service that is out there. So because they're marketing science-based, they've looked at these trends and they've got empirical evidence across service industry, car buying, food shopping, and the pattern is the same no matter what it is that you're in the market for. Yeah. So in fact, from the banking sector, it's fascinating because we've seen in South Africa in the last 5 years, Capitec has come in as a player within the market. And FNB as a bank has sort of kept its own. Nedbank has made big inroads in Midrand, you know, the area that I showed you? So it's almost like the young black professional market. They've done incredibly well at hanging on and growing their share within that market. But Capitec has taken a lot of the market, and the biggest losers in that whole environment are actually Absa and Standard Bank. So there's been a lot of shifts happening. So it shows you that, yes, it's very hard to gain share, but it absolutely can be done. And what's interesting is that you have a look at the data for Capitec, and back in 2010, they were probably had a presence in maybe 2 of the markets that we researched. The next time we looked, they were in about 10 markets. The next time it was more markets, and now they're literally sitting up there as one of the number 1 contenders in about 40 of the markets that are out there. So I think, I mean, I don't know what their strategy has been, but it very much seems as if they've taken area by area approach, and they've looked at the area and they've looked at the market within that area, and they've shaped their product offering to match that market, and they've gone after it aggressively. So. That's it. Silence. Well, good. I hope you found it useful.
Thank you very much. Henny Geldenes, our marketing manager, will do the closing remarks.
I say good morning, everybody, and thank you for that, Lynne and Daniel, for that insight. I think when we planned this session, it was more important just to give you an overview of what works in South Africa. I mean, especially at NMH, we preach that Namibia is completely different than South Africa. But there's some trends that from a consumer behavioral point of view, it might resonate with the business that you are in. And I mean, we've got some real role players in this room here when it comes to retail and buying. And at NMH, it's no different. And I think you'll appreciate that. I know the majority of you sitting here today, that when we do sit and we talk about strategy and where NMH, what brands your products needs to feature in NMH's brands, you'll appreciate that there is a lot that we do, and yet always we need to educate what we are investing in and where you need to feature your products. But today I'm going to do exactly the opposite. Ultimately, I think from a marketing management point of view, we as client executives, reps, marketing department think we run the newspaper, and then the editors think they run the newspaper. But the real reality is that they do run the newspaper. From an editorial point of view, content is king. And this new buzzwords that's going around in our industry is that liquid content. And it's about taking that editorial content, packaging it differently, and speaking to another audience. It might be the same audience that's reading our newsprint products. And you've heard that Lynne said that newsprint still works. And the majority of you sitting here today is obviously using our newsprint publications to get your message out. But what I don't think a lot of people know, and how would you know this if we don't tell you this and show this to you on a daily basis? But there's a whole other segment of readers that we are targeting on a daily basis, and it's purely because of content. It's not because of the advertisers, but it's because of the content. Our editors has taken a huge leap this last 4 or 5 years in packaging their content differently and sharing it with their audiences. I think that we are a very, I mean, Republikein, Namibian Sun, Algemene Zeitung are all national newspapers, but it's a community-based readership that you basically engage in. And that's what makes it so important for the editors to continue talking to those clients on a daily basis. And I mean, when we do read newspapers, whether you buy it at the street vendor, whether you get it delivered at your home or at your offices, or you go to the retail outlets to buy your newspapers, after 10 o'clock, news are relatively old. But news gets broken every single day by the minute. And it's obviously our job to educate and keep our readers enticed. They need to follow our platforms all the time. The last research that I can't afford to look at is basically to know that something happened in the main street of Independence Avenue and then people's read about it on News 24. It's not sustainable. People need to turn to our brands to actually read it. So that editors do have their challenges on a daily basis, how to get that news out. And what I'm showing you here is literally just an overview of our 3 daily newspapers. Now, Republikein being our flagship newspaper when it comes to print, yet the amount of money that you're spending in print, which, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying spend less in print, but there's another world out there that you have to complement what you're doing in print, because print still works. But then there's another percentage of our readership that you are not engaging. Now everybody, all the newspapers has got PDF versions of their newspapers on the websites. I mean, we've got a MyInfo app. It's all about content. But how we package your products that's been put into print is what makes it different and might set you apart from your competitor. And again, that buzzword of liquid content, it's about getting your products that you've printed, that you've displayed in the newspaper, that you've put in inserts. It's to flow that content digitally and getting your price and products out there, or even just your brand. So just in Republikein's scenario, this is how people access our content. Now, obviously, everybody in the printed industry is angry at Google. They're angry at Facebook. It's taken a lot of our print revenue away. But then again, we've started to embrace this. Every single year at WANIFRA, which is the World Newspapers Association of the World, all the huge newspapers come together, the editors come together. They're all angry at Google. They're all angry at Facebook. Yet Google and Facebook are one of the biggest contributors towards those conferences, because they know they're relying on the content of those newspaper titles to basically keep their content from happening, from people going back to their platform. But then again, on our platforms, this is how we break news. We've got news that's broken on our social media platforms, and yet we still don't have all the answers. I mean, you're not seeing Instagram anymore, or you're not seeing Instagram. So that's somewhere we need to up our game and get our products on the Instagram platforms, the Twitter. But Facebook in Namibia, it's what's resonating now, and that's what we are using to get our content out. But it's all a click to action. So you click on a story, you end up on our website. But there's still a little small percentage of people that go and type in www.republikein.com.na. But the majority of these people that accesses our content on Facebook ends up on our website. And that's where you need to be. And obviously, the time spent reading content on websites and on social media is a lot less. So your brand needs to be attractive. That digital or that liquid content of your brand needs to flow, and that's where creativity kicks in. When you look at the Namibian Sun, earlier I mentioned Republikein being our flagship newspaper when it comes to print. But Namibian Sun is literally the role player when it comes to digital. That print sample of 11,000 newspapers that newspaper does on a daily basis, you don't need to print 60,000 newspapers, because paper is becoming a real commodity. But how they engage their audience digitally is completely the opposite. So print is still relative here, but the majority of our audience we access via our social media platforms. And those are audiences that's ending up on our websites. Now, I'm sure 9 out of 10 people that's sitting here will tell me afterwards, Henny, but I'm having trouble to log in. I'm having trouble to register. But yet our readers of our content on a daily basis keep returning. Otherwise, Google Analytics would tell me that I've got a huge bounce rate, which is not the case. And obviously, speaking to the clients afterwards, we can share that detail with you. It's stats. It's Google source. So it's stats that doesn't lie to you. But then it just shows you this type of brand personality, how active they are on the social media and on our digital platforms. So if you are not in Namibian Sun's printed editions, for argument's sake, then digital is absolutely a no-brainer. And it is a very young, opinionated, patriotic type of consumer. And the content that the Namibian Sun is sharing on a daily basis digitally means something. The clients do gravitate towards it. The Allgemeine Zeitung, very niche brand. I mean, if you print 4,000 newspapers, 4,000 newspapers get read. I think the Germans generally, from what research also tells us, hy koop sy koerant, hy lees sy koerant. He doesn't share his newspaper. But then there's a huge audience that is following it digitally. But if you're in the tourism-related industry, or if you do have products that speaks to a German audience, that's a platform you cannot ignore. And again, it's targeting that specific brand personality. And then just to summarize, on a daily basis, I think NMH has never been in a better position than we are in today. Being a journalist in today's world, in today's time, is the best time ever, because you can have conversations on a daily basis with your readers. And then obviously, we know that when we do break news, you don't have to wait until the newspaper comes out the next day to share that content. So in summary, thank you, Lynne, for sharing that insight information. Daniel, anytime you get an economist to speak about the economy, it's daunting, but thank you for summarizing that, and hopefully our retail clients and general clients, even on our social media platforms who's tuning in, it's got a better overview of where we currently are and what we need to do, the conversations we need to start and take further. And then generally, thank you to all of our guests sitting here. Without you, obviously, we would not be functioning. We would not be able to speak to these audiences. But while we do speak to these readers, make sure that your brands are there. So appreciate that when we do spend time with you strategizing publications that you should be in, and then when we come around and we say, but there's more. There's literally half of our readership that is accessing us after the newspapers have had its time of the day. Inserts have never been in a better space at NMH. It's working. We see clients still have time to pick up the newspaper, not necessarily read the news in the first 5 pages, but accessing the classifieds, the content we write about the motoring industry, the tenders, the notices, the vacancies, and then obviously the retail type of advertisements we carry in our newspapers. So we obviously invite you to engage us, make time for us when myself or my marketing managers or even my client executives sit with you and keep challenging us on platforms where you are seeing we are engaging with our audiences and ask us how you can get onto that platforms. We've got the creative teams to assist you in digitalizing your advertisements. I think production single-handedly is the biggest challenge in Namibia. People don't have video advertisements, they don't have animations, and they don't have access to people that's giving it to them. And even if they do, it costs an arm and a leg. But at Namibia Media Holdings, we've got this one-stop shop where we can assist you with that production. We can assist you with packaging your content so that it's part of that digital, that liquid content that we basically have 24/7. And in the space that we are in, that's content that's relevant to us, to our readers, and obviously, hopefully, in the next couple of decades, it still remains relative, and it's a sustainable business model. And while we do that, and while we share that content, make use of it, take the opportunities, and take advantage of our readers that we engage. So thank you very much for coming, spending time with us, and yes, let the conversations begin, and let's see how we can help each other so that you can get more people and more consistent people in your shops supporting your brands and products. So enjoy the day, and yeah, Black Friday's around the corner. So hopefully this helps you to strategize. I know the majority of you in this room has already approached us. We've got some amazing deals that we've conceptualized for you guys. But yeah, Black Friday's around the corner. Tell us about your specials, and let's do something creative to put you on a different level than your competitors. So thank you, enjoy the day, and well done.